There's a drink sitting in the refrigerated aisle of almost every grocery store in America. Glass bottle, clean label, $6. What most people don't realize is that the exact same drink can be made in a kitchen with three things: tea, sugar, and time. No factory, no equipment, no brand. And the cost? About $1. What's strange is that this isn't some new health trend. People have been brewing this drink for more than 2,000 years. Entire households used to keep it alive in a jar on the counter, passing the culture from one family to the next. So how did something that simple, something people once made almost for free, turn into a premium wellness product sold back to us for $5 or $6 a bottle? That story turns out to be much bigger than a drink. Most people who buy a bottle of kombucha at the grocery store aren't thinking about fermentation cultures or microbial ecosystems. They see a clean label, a promise of gut health, maybe a recommendation from a friend, and it feels like a smarter drink choice than soda, so they grab a bottle. The strange part is what happens behind that simple decision. The global kombucha market is now worth more than $4 billion, and it's one of the fastest growing beverage categories in the world. New brands launch every year, shelf space keeps expanding, prices keep climbing, but the drink at the center of that entire industry hasn't actually changed. It's still the same fermented tea people were brewing quietly in their kitchens across Russia, China, and Eastern Europe for generations. Same ingredients, same fermentation, same living culture. The difference isn't the drink, it's the system built around it. And once you understand what is actually happening inside that bottle and how simple the process really is, something about that $6 price tag starts to look very different. So what actually makes kombucha different from ordinary iced tea? The answer is a living culture called a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Think of it like the starter used in sourdough bread. You feed it sugar, it feeds on the tea, and over the course of a week, the liquid slowly changes into something chemically different from what you started with. Yeast convert the sugars into small amounts of alcohol and carbon dioxide. Then bacteria take that alcohol and transform it into organic acids, the compounds that give kombucha its tart flavor and natural carbonation. But the surprising part isn't just the chemistry, it's the ecosystem. A mature SCOBY isn't a single organism, it's a layered microbial community. Dozens of species of bacteria and yeast working together in a kind of balance that keeps the fermentation stable batch after batch. And that biological activity doesn't just change taste, it changes how the liquid behaves in the body. A randomized controlled trial from Georgetown University Medical Center found that participants with type 2 diabetes who drank kombucha daily for 4 weeks experienced significant reductions in fasting blood glucose levels compared to a placebo group. No one is calling it a cure, but it points to something interesting. Fermentation doesn't simply flavor the drink, it transforms it. The tea and sugar you started with become something biologically different by the time the process finishes. And humans have been quietly using that transformation for a very long time. The story of kombucha starts much earlier than most people realize. The earliest records appear in northeast China around 220 BCE during the Qin Dynasty. At the time, it was known as the tea of immortality, not as marketing language, but as a genuine belief. People noticed that something about this fermented drink seemed to support health and longevity. They didn't understand bacteria or microbial ecosystems yet, but they could see the results. Over time, the drink began to travel. By the 5th century, it had spread through Korean and Japanese trade routes. In Japan, historical accounts describe it being consumed by samurai, not because it was exotic, but because it was practical. A fermented drink that could be brewed from simple ingredients almost anywhere. Then, the culture moved west. By the early 20th century, kombucha had become a normal part of everyday life across Russia and Eastern Europe. In many homes, it simply lived on the kitchen counter. A glass jar, a cloth cover, tea and sugar feeding a living culture that regenerated itself week after week. Families shared SCOBYs with neighbors. Some cultures stayed alive for decades, passed quietly from one household to the next. No labels, no brands, no refrigeration, just a living fermentation that anyone could keep going. And that's the strange part. The drink itself hasn't changed, but the world around it has. So how did something that lived quietly in kitchens for 2,000 years end up behind refrigerated glass at $5 or $6 a bottle? The answer isn't a conspiracy, it's structure. Fermentation is alive, and living products don't behave the way modern supply chains prefer them to. In a home kitchen, that's not a problem. A jar sits on the counter. The culture keeps fermenting. The flavor changes slightly from batch to batch. But in a commercial system, unpredictability is expensive. Retailers need products that taste the same every time. Distributors need products that stay stable for weeks while they move across warehouses and trucks. And living fermentation doesn't integrate cleanly into that kind of infrastructure. So the industry adapted the process. Fermentation became controlled, standardized, and often partially halted to keep bottles stable during transport. That made kombucha easier to package, easier to ship, and easier to sell at scale. But it also changed how people encountered it. What had once been a living process happening in kitchens slowly became a finished product sitting on a shelf. Over time, the habit shifted. Making it became unusual. Buying it became normal. And something that once required almost no money gradually became part of a multi-billion-dollar beverage category. Not because the drink changed, but because the system around food did. Here's the part that rarely gets mentioned on the label. Nothing about this drink requires a factory. The traditional version was never a product at all. It was a process. Tea, sugar, a living culture. Left in a jar on the counter, the culture feeds, ferments, and slowly transforms the liquid over the course of a week. The same culture can keep going for months, sometimes years, which means the real shift isn't technical, it's psychological. Once you realize how simple the process actually is, kombucha stops looking like a specialty beverage and starts looking like something people once kept alive in their kitchens, the same way they kept sourdough or yogurt cultures. Not because it was trendy, because it was easy, and because once a culture is alive in your kitchen, it keeps producing the same drink week after week. No brand required, just the same fermentation people have been maintaining for generations. Two versions of the same drink. One lives in a kitchen, a glass jar on the counter, covered with a cloth, fed every week. A culture that quietly regenerates itself, passed between neighbors and families for generations. It costs almost nothing and requires almost no technology. The other version sits behind refrigerated glass, amber bottle, clean label, a price that reflects not the drink itself, but everything built around it. Packaging, stability, distribution, convenience. Neither version is wrong. Modern supply chains make food easier to move, easier to store, easier to sell. That convenience has real value, but something shifts once you recognize what you're actually looking at. That bottle isn't a new invention, it's a very old fermentation, adapted to fit a modern system. The knowledge behind it never disappeared, it just slowly stopped being passed from kitchen to kitchen. And once you realize that, the drink on the shelf starts to look a little different.